Irak'ta ana duasını Ulug' Rabbim icabet kıl Zindanda ata duasını Ulug' Rabbim icabet kıl Musafir yetim duasını Ulug' Rabbim icabet kıl Vatansiz g'arib duasını Ulug' Rabbim nasib ayla Ko'rishga vatan azodini Ulug' Rabbim nasib ayla Ko'rishga zolim zavolini Ulug' Rabbim nasib ayla Ko'rishga onam jamolini Ulug' Rabbim nasib ayla Suyishga vatan tuprog'ini Ulug' Rabbim nasib ayla Kezishga vatan gulbog'ini Ulug' Rabbim nasib ayla Vatan tuprog'ida o'lishni
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear brothers and sisters, welcome to another special of Talkies Turkestan. I have a very special guest with me today to talk about what is happening in the region and just talking about the various issues that are happening with the Uyghurs. Today I have joining with me Sophie Richardson. You may have heard of her. She's the China director at the Human Rights Watch, a graduate of the University of Virginia, the Hopkins-Nanjing Program, and Oberlin College. Dr. Richardson is the author of numerous articles on domestic Chinese political reform, democratization, and human rights in Cambodia, China, Indonesia, Hong Kong, the Philippines, and Vietnam. She has testified before the European Parliament and the US Senate and House of Representatives. She has provided commentary to the BBC, CNN, the Far Eastern Economic Review, Foreign Policy, National Public Radio, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Dr. Richardson is the author of China, Cambodia, and the Five Principles of Peaceful Coexistence, and an in-depth examination of China's foreign policy since the 1954's Geneva Conference, including rare interviews with policymakers. So I guess I'll invite her to our stream today. How are you, Sophie?
Hi, Arslan. It's great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise in what is happening right now to the Uyghurs. So I guess I'll get straight into it. The sound's coming through okay?
Yeah, it's absolutely fine.
Okay, excellent. We're just going to go in right into it with my first question. I want to get into this debate that's been happening recently about what is actually happening to the Uyghurs, whether it's a genocide or crime against humanity or some other label. And as far as the Human Rights Watch is concerned, and I quote, Human Rights Watch has not documented the existence of the necessary genocidal intent at this time. What would that evidence need to be for the Human Rights Watch to come to that conclusion that what is happening to the Uyghurs is genocide? And my follow-up to that would be, are such labels important? Because we've seen some countries like the United States and various parliaments, like in the UK just last month, declare it a genocide, but nothing really tangible coming from it, at least not just yet.
Right. Well, let me, maybe I can make three quick points and take those a little bit in reverse, if you don't mind. And really, the first thing that I want to say is part of the reason I'm so pleased to be with you today is to be able to say to a community of people and your listeners who have had the confidence in us to share their stories with us and to teach us a great deal about their lives and the traumas that they've been through. We're so grateful for that trust, and we really think about the community a lot. And want to thank people and want people to know that we think about them all the time. But to answer your question, Arslan, about the labels and the extent to which they matter. You know, part of what matters is figuring out how to get any of this evidence of human rights crimes in front of a competent court. And the reality is that only a very tiny handful of people have actually been prosecuted on charges of genocide. And they've been cases like, for example, Srebrenica or Rwanda, where there was overwhelming evidence of the state's intent, meaning written evidence, statements by policymakers, to destroy in whole or in part, which is the language of the Genocide Convention, particular communities. You know, so it's a very high legal threshold. At the same time, I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding that crimes against humanity are somehow a far lesser charge, and they're not. You know, these are some of the most serious crimes under international human rights law, and they do create certain additional options for prosecution, which is part of what makes it, in some ways, both a substantive but also a tactical choice, because most democracies consider allegations of crimes against humanity eligible for what are called universal jurisdiction cases. So, for example, some people may know about the cases recently of Syrians being prosecuted in Germany over torture that took place in Syria. So it didn't involve Germans in any sense, but the case was heard in German courts. In principle, cases could be heard against Chinese government officials in courts in other parts of the world over their complicity in crimes against humanity against Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and Kyrgyz. But to answer that other piece of the question about governments and parliaments and what they're doing, I think they're extremely concerned about what's happening in the region. I think they want very much to acknowledge the community's agony and try to push their own policymakers forward to actually act and not just use certain terms.
I guess when we think about courts, the ICC sort of comes to mind. And so to push that genocide court, we think, we could see CCP officials, especially the main perpetrators of the camps, to see a day in that sort of court. But China is not a party to that ICC statute. So while the ICC could assume, or other courts could assume jurisdiction if the UN Security Council refers a situation in the Uyghur region to the courts, because China isn't a permanent member of that security, because China is a permanent member of the Security Council, they could easily oppose that, couldn't they? And so then it's like, well, what else can we do? Like, what would be the end game here?
Right. Well, again, there are a couple of different possibilities, one of which are these universal jurisdiction cases. But, in other situations that are sort of roughly comparable, what's happened is, it takes a long time and it will be a heck of a political fight, but it's the creation of an ad hoc tribunal. There's one for example, there's one created for Cambodia. There have been other ones created, with varying degrees of international involvement for other kinds of serious human rights crimes or cases. There's the ICTY for Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia. There's an open discussion now about what may happen with respect to prosecutions around the Rohingya, although there's a very creative dimension to that case where the ICC is saying that because Rohingya were driven out of Myanmar, which is not a party to the ICC, into Bangladesh, which is, that some of the cases could be heard, that created the possibility for cases to be heard at the ICC. So I wouldn't rule that out entirely. In the case that some people tried to take to the ICC earlier this year, was not rejected because the court isn't concerned about what's happening to Uyghurs. In fact, I think there is a level of awareness and concern. It was that the case that was brought, the court didn't have jurisdiction over. But it's one way of sort of taking a sounding of the level of interest of the court. But I do think there are some possibilities, and people will often say to us, well, that's crazy to imagine an ad hoc tribunal for Chinese government officials. But I both think that the world needs to be ambitious in challenging the Chinese government, and I think it needs to do for Uyghurs and other affected Turkic communities what it does in other situations. Because I think it's critical out of all of this that the Chinese government's sense of impunity be challenged. That it is not above the law, that it will be held accountable in the same way that other states will. And I think that does kind of motivate some governments to engage more on these particular aspects of the problem.
There was a recent article published on the Human Rights Watch called Break Their Lineage, Break Their Roots. And I suggest everyone have a read of that. And it gives a recent summary of what's been happening in the region, just to get some information, in general, most recent. I think it was published around 2-3 weeks ago. But I want to ask, when we compare getting information from the region to other regions in the world, how difficult is it? Because one, internet access, the people themselves, not just Uyghurs, even Chinese people don't have access to Twitter, to Google, to Facebook, and you don't have people posting like you would see, Syrians posting on YouTube, or you got what's happening in Burma with the coup, people posting regularly on Facebook, and we've seen them, the government, or say the military, following China's footsteps in the taking down the internet. So what are some of the difficulties you guys face when getting this information and then confirming it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's certainly gotten tougher over the last 10 years to try to get people into the region or find people who've recently left, partly because the doors have slammed shut. We know that the Chinese government surveils people outside the country and will hunt them down to try to force them to be sent back. But we're pretty confident in the material that we've gathered from people who are outside the country, who had been in what we refer to as political re-education camps, or who had not been detained but who've recently left the region. We explicitly, for our 2018 report, looked for people who had left since 2017, so could speak to the most recent situation. The work that we've done on abuses of surveillance technology is interesting because a lot of it is just sitting out there online waiting to be found. And in a way, it doesn't involve needing to interview people. We reverse engineered a police app to show what kinds of behavior the authorities now consider suspicious. But a lot of the other information, we've worked to interview people who are still in the region or who've recently left and cross-check that with things like court records, for example, or with members of particular communities. The work that we did a couple of months ago about rates of imprisonment was actually some work we did collaboratively with the wonderful Xinjiang Victims Database group that's run by Jean Bunin, that's gathering huge amounts of information that people are choosing to share about their own experiences. And essentially what we did was analyze a subset of their data. But that's coming from, some of that information is coming from official sources. We have yet to have anybody say that we've gotten the facts wrong. So we're pretty confident. And what we wanted to do with that report was essentially make the legal case, our own legal case, that these rise to crimes against humanity. We have a team of people within Human Rights Watch who do nothing but work on international justice issues. So this was a collaboration between my team and theirs, to make the case that this rises to the level of urgent international attention.
And so for everyone, for those of you who want to check out that article, one of them is China's Algorithms of Repression, and it looks into the iJop app that Sophie was talking about, and you can get a more in-depth look into how China surveils Uyghurs through quote-unquote Muslim tracking apps, which was very interesting when I first saw that article. So make sure you guys check that out. I guess, moving on to that, we were just talking about, or I just mentioned Muslim tracking apps. As we mentioned, that some governments like Canada, the European Union, the United States, the UK have imposed targeted sanctions on Chinese government officials and other agencies and companies who are directly and indirectly involved with rights violations. And we've seen them join in statements of condemnation at the UN Human Rights Council and Third Committee. However, organizations like the OIC, Organization for Islamic Cooperation, governments of Muslim majority nations seem not just silent, but supportive of the Chinese regime's policies against the Uyghurs. What role do these or can these nations play when it comes to somehow stopping China's brutal oppression?
Well, I think bodies like the OIC have been instrumental in calling out, Islamophobia and discrimination against Muslims all around the world. But I have to tell you, I'm a little puzzled when I pick up an OIC report that has, 10 pages about, Islamophobia in Detroit or some part of the US and nothing about the Uyghur region. And don't get me wrong, there's of course Islamophobia here in the US and it should be called out. Human Rights Watch does that all the time. But to avoid talking about it in China, I think tells us a couple of things. And it's one that, power and money matter more to some of these governments than their commitment to how other Muslims are being persecuted. And I think that's a real problem, because if some of the OIC member states were to support, for example, an investigation into a government that is, tearing down mosques and arresting religious historians and bulldozing traditional cemeteries, if some OIC member states governments joined in that call, I think it would be a very powerful way of signaling concern. And so far, the only governments that have really spoken publicly about this are Turkey and Albania and Bosnia. But it would be really good to see some of the Gulf states, some of the Southeast Asian states, and any of the governments that are concerned about rights, and criticize violations of Muslims' rights in other parts of the world, demonstrate some concern about what's happening to this community inside China. It's a real problem, because it sort of allows the Chinese government to say, look, the Muslim world supports us, they're with us, and they're fine with our policies of suppressing faith. I mean, just so that your listeners know, from HRW's perspective, of all the governments in the world that place limitations on the practice of Islam, it's actually the Chinese government that has the most pervasive, thoroughgoing architecture of repression. And that requires some discussion, I think.
China's argument is, well, they've had ambassadors or people from Muslim majority countries visit the area. They've even had religious figures visit the area. And when they go and visit hotels, there are prayer mats, there is the Quran in the hotels, and everything seems to be really nice. And they go, some of the freedoms that the Uyghurs seem to have, we don't have in our own countries, they say. Can we talk about the unfettered aspect, the unfettered access aspect or lack of it, and how these figures who visit the region then go back and tell their people there's really nothing going on?
Well, it's not just that. It's that, the Chinese government takes people on tours and shows them only what the Chinese government wants them to see, with a view towards those diplomats going home and saying everything is fine. But it goes further than that. It was Pakistan, on behalf of the OIC, that went out onto the floor of the Human Rights Council within the last year or two and actually praised the Chinese government's attitude towards Muslim people. And at the same time, Imran Khan keeps saying he doesn't know or he isn't well informed about what's happening in Xinjiang. And this is really, I think, deeply problematic. And wherever there is room for people to try to move their governments on this issue, I think that would be extremely helpful. When we see, for example, various religious communities, I remember when the Imam Council of Australia actually published a statement of concern about what was happening in Xinjiang. Any of that, or concern by groups like the Nahdlatul Ulama in Indonesia, it can be civic groups, it can be religious groups, but speaking up counts for a lot right now, a lot.
As you know, and everyone else knows, the Winter Olympics are happening next year, and in Beijing, and we seem to send the wrong message, not just to the world, but China themselves, when we allow them to host such important events, which are supposed to be, say, boosting or promoting, human rights or the coming together of human beings, why hasn't the IOC or more pressure been put onto the Olympic Committee to, say, move the Olympics or stop them from happening in Beijing? Because they've made similar moves when it came to South Africa, but when it comes to China, it's like no mention of it, or statements like, why should we be punishing athletes? And we know that China uses this platform to promote themselves, and in essence, it's like saying, you know what, you can commit genocide or crimes against humanity, and yet we'll give this to you.
Yeah, well, we actually objected in 2015 when China bid to host another Olympics, and it was precisely because it had broken all the promises on human rights it had made in order to get the 2008 Games. And in sort of strange irony, the other country that was under consideration at the time was Kazakhstan, which has obviously given some haven to Uyghurs and Kazakhs from China over the last several years. But we're big fans of figuring out how to not give the Chinese government any political legitimacy or plaudits for hosting these games. And the IOC has made all of these nice sounding human rights commitments since 2015 around human rights. And they will say that some of these don't apply for Beijing because they were adopted since Beijing won this round of the games. But my sense from talking to the IOC is that they're incredibly enthusiastic and proud of these new human rights standards they've adopted when we're talking about upholding them in countries where it's easy to do so, like Japan or France, and not enthusiastic about talking about them when it comes to a place like China. And it's really distressing and patronizing, I think, when the IOC says to a group like ours, well, the world is complex, and the Olympics are a force for good, and we're just not going to talk about crimes against humanity. And it's extraordinary. And I think people should direct any commentary they have about this to the IOC itself. But I think they should also be, talking to the top Olympic sponsors, the big companies that are involved in this. And I think I think there are probably a lot of athletes who are themselves not thrilled about the idea of competing in this environment. And I think it's unfair that they should have to put up with this too. I mean, we already know of many big deal athletes who don't want to compete in a place where this is happening. And there have been some, I think, very high profile sports people. Think about Sonny Bill Williams, the former All Black, who had spoken about the Uyghurs and been concerned. Athletes have principles too. And I can only imagine that there are a lot of them who don't want to have to compete there, and that, they shouldn't have to. You shouldn't have to give up your principles in order to pursue your athletic aspirations. But Beijing will use it as a propaganda win. And I think the trick for any concerned government is to deny that. I was just talking to a bunch of parliamentarians today about how they should, have a big high profile send off for athletes in whatever your home country is before they leave, but you don't need to accompany them to China, right? Have the celebration at home. Don't be part of, Beijing's propaganda exercises.
A question that I get a lot, and you may get this as well, is why? And someone who has been following what's been happening to the Uyghurs for years, how has that why changed? Meaning, why is this happening? Or why is China doing this to the Uyghurs? How has that changed over the years? And what are we seeing now? What is that why? Why is China opening up concentration camps? And I urge people again to read that article that I showed a moment ago as to what's a quick summary of what's been happening. Why is it happening? What has happened, and why is it happening now?
Oh gosh, Arslan, that's a huge question to try to answer briefly. Yeah. I'll do my best. I'm going to point to two particular factors. I mean, one is a long-standing one that the Chinese government has viewed Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz as disloyal others, as strange, as communities that needed to be controlled. But I think that changed with Xi Jinping, and that his campaign of sinicization is not even about sinicizing, meaning just adopting Han culture. I think it's about being loyal, being made into loyal political foot soldiers for the Chinese Communist Party. And it's playing out for different communities in different ways. I mean, there are terrible violations in Tibet too, or against people of Mongolian descent. But I think the combination of the sense of problematic others and this idea of reshaping people into politically reliable people means for Uyghurs making sure that they're essentially not Uyghurs anymore, that they can't worship, that they can't use their language, that they can't practice their traditional culture, that all of these elements are the ones that are precisely being tormented out of people in arbitrary detention. That you have to basically give up your identity in order to get out of these facilities. But last but not least, I think Xi Jinping and Chen Chuanguo and others are doing this because they can, because they think they can get away with it. And that, I think, is where the obligation is on all of us as human beings to make sure that that is not okay. Just before we started this conversation, I was listening to Tursme Ziaoudun testify to the U.S.'s House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee, just gut-wrenching. And she was asked how she had the courage to testify. And she said, it's my sense of humanity and wanting to keep this from happening to other people. And I think that's where it's essential we prove Beijing wrong, that it cannot get away with this, because heaven only knows what it does next if it succeeds.
I just want to urge everyone to follow Sophie on her Twitter. Any sort of updates, you can find her there. So all the articles she posts and her comments are very enlightening and highlight the oppression, not just what happens in China, but in other regions in Southeast Asia as well. Before I let you go, Sophie, is there anything that you would like to mention, any projects that are coming up, anything that we could look forward to? Or
well, we've been working on the treatment of Uyghurs and others across the region for 25 years and have no intention of stopping. There are going to be two fairly high-profile events next week, one in the European Parliament, when I'm delighted to be joined by Jahar Ilham Tohti's daughter. We're going to be talking about European EU policy, and then there'll be another high-level event on Wednesday, also talking about the crisis in the Uyghur region. But we're doing research on everything from the Bingtuan to religious restrictions and everywhere in between, but also are incredibly concerned about people who had family members go silent. And people are welcome to be in touch from wherever you are in the world. We'd be happy to talk to you and try to be helpful to you as much as we possibly can.
Can you hear me, Sophie?
I can hear you. I can't see you.
Okay, that's fine. I seem to be frozen. Yeah, what I'm going to do is, you still stay on. I should be back soon. I'm going to be coming back now. Okay, there I am. I think there's a bit of an issue.
It's okay.
And I should be okay now. Anyway, thank you so much. We seem to have a glitch. I think you guys can still hear me. I'm going to end the show now. Thank you so much for joining me. And I hope everyone can share Sophie's expertise, and make sure you guys follow up and catch up on what's been happening through the Human Rights Watch. Thank you so much, Sophie. Until next time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Don't leave me yet, Sophie. I'm just going to close up. I just still stay on. I just want to say goodbye off screen as well.
Sure.
Ümit üzme aziz halqim, ümit üzme ey ana yurt. Biz atlandık bu küreşke, o yıl taştak uyuşup. Allah verse bu nusretni, bizgilerimiz sep bulur.